All right. So far this unit, we have covered the beginnings of the Roaring Twenties as far as politics. Remember, pro-business Republican presidencies return to normalcy, the changes in the economy, the new ways to buy during this consumer revolution. Plus, we have a changing of society. We have an emergence of a new class, the teenagers. Plus, we have women changing their roles. We have the eruption of culture in the Harlem Renaissance. And all of these changes are sounding like they're positive. The Roaring Twenties is wonderful. But we have to look at the other side of this and what effect these changing attitudes had in the 1920s. Now, this first part is probably going to sound familiar. You've talked about the Red Scare before, but this is going to be what we call the first Red Scare. The second Red Scare is the one that typically people think of in the 1950s, okay? But this Red Scare is going to be from 1918 to 1920, and it's really going to spark because of the communist revolts that had been spreading through Central and Eastern Europe. And when we saw communism take over in the Soviet Union under Lenin, this is going to cause the United States to feel a little uneasy that European anarchists are going to come to the United States and that they're going to take over democracy. And then we'll see our own communist revolution take place here. One of the biggest places we look to, or groups that we look to in the United States as a potential place for the communist revolts to begin, were labor unions. So when labor strikes took place in the United States because of inflation created by World War I, we get a little nervous, and there is a fear for the people at home. This Red Scare was a wave of fear of suspected communists and radicals that were plotting revolutions within the United States. Fear is a huge driving factor, and those fears are going to cause the government to take some pretty radical actions, and one of those radical actions were the Palmer Raids. The Palmer Raids were named after the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who literally conducted raids arresting thousands of supposed radicals, and what they targeted were immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, saying that they were potential threats to the United States. And these quote unquote radicals were deported after the raids. So we would see people quite literally busting down doors, going into people's homes, arresting them, and deporting them just because of where they were from. This is going to be a trend of the United States, using fear to push the actions of the government and gain support of the people because they were scared. And at this time, we were scared of communists. And really broadening that, we were scared of immigrants. One of the biggest trials to take place, most notable, that illustrates this fear is going to be the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. This trial is going to take place over the span of 7 years from 1920 to 1927. One of the biggest characters of this trial is going to be the American Civil Liberties Union. You've heard of them before. They're still around, the ACLU. This group does exactly what they named themselves after. They protect the liberties of the American people. Okay, that's their goal. They begin to form in response to those Palmer raids because that quite literally was going against the rights of the American people. Okay, and what we see in this case is we're going to have two Italian immigrants who were known anarchists. These guys are Sacco and Vanzetti. They're both going to be tried and found guilty because there was a holdup and a man was killed. And the accusation here was that two immigrant men had held up these guys and stolen from them, who died in the process. But there's going to be very little evidence that connects Sacco and Vanzetti to the actual crime. But what is seen here is an opportunity to make an example of immigrants who were known anarchists committing a crime in the United States, and this is put to the extreme. Even with very little evidence, both Sacco and Vanzetti are going to be sentenced to death. Most people are going to suspect that they were charged based on their political views and the fact that they were immigrants rather than the facts of the crimes. And what this case represents is the nativist attitudes of the time. It didn't matter if Sacco and Vanzetti had actually been guilty of killing two men in a holdup. What mattered was that they were immigrants and they were anarchists, and they were the image of what all Americans were fearing during this time. And this case was a way to make an example out of them. So let's think back. What was nativism? Nativism is that belief that if you are a native-born citizen, you are better than immigrants. Okay, this idea is going to be strengthened by World War I, the Russian revolutions, the Red Scare, and it pushes people in the United States to say, well, I was born here, so I'm better. Any immigrant, anybody who is related to an immigrant is less than because they're a threat and we fear them. Remember what was set up to limit immigration during this time. We've talked about all of these already because remember, this is going to take place in the beginnings of the 1920s. Remember, we had the Emergency Quota Act, the National Origins Act that set up that quota system. Remember the cartoon of the funnel here. We're trying to limit the amount of immigrants coming into the United States. The Red Scare and the fear in the United States of immigrants is going to be attached to that idea. This National Origins Act, the Emergency Quota Act, set up a limit to how many immigrants of each nationality could come to the United States. Now, the only place that it's going to not apply to is Mexico. We're looking at immigrants coming from Europe, okay? As I mentioned in my previous video, the KKK is going to see a resurgence during this time. And when we think of the KKK that you've studied in history, typically you think it forms in opposition to Black Americans. But they opposed more people as well. This focus on labor unions and promoting hatred of Black Americans, Catholics, Jews, immigrants, they really are gonna play on the fears of the Red Scare at this time as well. Their big opposition is the idea is to not embrace the idea of the melting pot. That idea that the American culture is a mixture of many cultures is not something that they favor. The KKK is going to push this idea of nativism. But if you ask me, who really is native in a country where we were all immigrants at one point? Just saying. Also during this time, just to add to the pressure a little bit, Prohibition is going to be around 1920 to 1933. World War I is going to push for the support of the temperance movement. Remember, the temperance movement supported getting rid of alcohol in the United States. You get a bad temper when you drink. The way they promoted it during World War I is that it was not patriotic to make alcohol when those supplies could be used to make food for soldiers, which is a pretty good campaign. The 18th Amendment is going to be ratified in 1919, and it's going to forbid the manufacturing, distribution, and sale of alcohol. Notice that it doesn't say you couldn't drink it. You just can't make it, sell it, or distribute it. So in retaliation, people are going to make their own alcohol. They're going to smuggle it in from other countries. You're going to see bootleggers, the organized crime in the United States starts to come about because of Prohibition, because they want to make and sell alcohol illegally. Speakeasies, those underground bars, are going to sell alcohol in secret in the cities. Prohibition is literally the worst experiment that the United States could have ever come up with. And that's why we reverse it with the 21st Amendment in 1933. There was no way to enforce and control the organized crime that had erupted during the time where alcohol was made illegal. Okay, there wasn't enough, even if we dedicated all of the police force in all of the United States, there was no way to actually make sure that nobody was making, selling, and distributing alcohol at all. So we reversed it with the 21st Amendment in 1933. No more prohibition. The Scopes monkey trial. There are two court cases that you need to know. You're going to do some homework on them tonight. The Sacco and Vanzetti trial is number 1. The Scopes monkey trial is number 2. The Scopes monkey trial is all about evolution. So if you remember Darwin and his finches, this one's going to be pretty easy. Charles Darwin had developed that theory of evolution, that complex forms of life develop from simpler ones, that humans developed from apes. Now, this is a super controversial idea, especially during a time where religion was very important to the United States. Before the 1920s, the United States, if you went to school, your math book, your science book, your English book, your history book, it was all the same book and it was all the Bible. But we're going to start to see a transition as we move away from that one-room schoolhouse, this emphasis being placed on education. We start to make education a little bit better. And we start to stray away from just the teachings of the Bible to a little bit different forms of education. And there's going to be some pushback. And in 1915, Tennessee had passed a law making it absolutely illegal to teach the theory of evolution in schools. Now, here we go again. We have the American Civil Liberties Union that is going to argue this goes against freedom of religion because maybe people don't believe in the creation story, and maybe they don't want to be just teaching the story of creation in science class. So the ACLU is going to convince a biology teacher who goes by the name of John Scopes to test the law, because in order to prove a law is kind of faulty and goes against the Constitution, you have to break it and you have to get it through the court systems to prove that somebody didn't break the law. It's the law that's bad. So Scopes is going to teach evolution in his Tennessee school, and he's going to be arrested and found guilty of breaking the law because he did. And this case is going to be splashed all over the newspapers, and it's going to become an argument between culture and religion. We have Clarence Darrow, who is going to be one of the defense attorneys of John Scopes, facing off against William Jennings Bryan, who we've heard his name many times now. He's going to be the defender of fundamentalism, the teachings of religion. And these two guys are just going to go at each other's necks in the courtroom. And at the end of the day, the Scopes is going to be fined and he's going to be found guilty. But what it represents is that we are shifting away from tradition. We are moving forward. And the 1920s is all about getting us out of this traditional theory of what life should be and moving into the future. The change and diversity is good. The 1920s are a time of advancement and contradictions for culture, for tradition. As much as our politics and economics might be going backwards into the Stone Ages, our society and culture is going to be thrown into the future. There are going to be clashes that come with that because some people don't like change. They don't want to see this change in society. But after this decade, tradition will be there, but society is going to be forever changed by this decade here. The music, the culture, the clothing, everything that comes out of the 1920s is going to change the United States forever. And that includes all the changes that bring us into the Great Depression, which is where we'll go next time. Don't forget about your homework for tonight, and any questions, you let me know.